today I want to kind of flip things over and I want to talk about heaven, and specifically heaven within the context of free will.
Unless she's discussed it somewhere else, Kristi here has added her name to the long list of atheist YouTubers to give their thoughts on the incompatibility of heaven and free will. Has she debunked the notion of a free heaven? She says no.
And I'm not claiming to have the answers. I'm also not claiming to have dismantled all of these theologies.
But then implies maybe.
People say, oh, well, these are hundreds or thousands of years of theology and you think you can just come in and break it apart? Well, maybe, but that's not what I think I'm doing here, and it's not my goal.
So let's hear what Kristi has to say about what I think is a fantastic question, but a not so fantastic take.
Because free will is a very hot topic in Christian debates. I think a lot of Christians don't agree on what free will is, if they have it. Free will gets brought up a lot when we have these discussions specifically about the problem of evil, where you have the non-Christian and the non-Christian says, well, if God is so good and God is so loving, why is there so much suffering and pain in the world? How come he doesn't just swoop in and stop it? And the Christian often responds and says, free will, duh, because we have free will. God was so kind to give us this freedom of choice. And, he didn't want robots for him. He didn't want to force us to love him or to choose to do good. He wanted us to choose it for ourselves. And I think that this makes them feel as though they have more meaning and purpose within their existence, which I can completely understand, this kind of autonomy within their existence, which is something I think we all want to have. We all want to feel free within ourselves. And I don't think the Christian is any different.
Now, all these things she says about meaning and purpose are true. I hope that Christianity is true, and it is true that there are a lot of things I like about Christianity. But in case this is being brought up as a subtle way of suggesting that we're just in this for wish fulfillment and we're so biased that we can't think reasonably about things, I want to admit that, of course, my motivations are going to be impacted. My bias is there. It's going to be impacted by what I want to be true. But wish fulfillment doesn't work as some sort of a decisive blow, and Kristi didn't say that it did. But just to get this out of the way, because the suggestion might be there are a lot of things that people hope will be true that actually end up to be true. For example, young people may hope that one day that they will find the person of their dreams and get married and have this big wedding, and they might even imagine the exact place they want to have the wedding. And guess what? It all happens pretty much like that. Some people will hope that one day they'll be rich and powerful, and sometimes people become rich and powerful. So wish fulfillment is something we might need to take into consideration, but it doesn't really count against the truth of what's being said. You have to deal with the arguments themselves and the reasoning to get there.
And so the Christian will respond and they say, well, we have free will, and that is the reason there's so much suffering and pain. Is just the consequence of freedom. They say that the most loving thing a God could do is to create us with this freedom, and to not just create us as robots, that it would just be forced to do whatever God wants us to do. And I think that sounds really good on the surface. But if we just dig into it a little bit more, we ask a few questions, I don't know that we can truly make free will, or the concept of free will within Christianity, and the concept of heaven, I don't think we can make these two things fit together.
So this is really helpful here. Kristi has made a claim. She has claimed that the concept of free will and the Christian concept of heaven don't fit together. Now, I think that they do fit together, and I think I can tell you exactly why and how they fit together. But even if I couldn't tell you exactly how and why they fit together, she has made this really super easy here, because what she has made is this claim that they don't, and this means that all we need to do is provide a possible explanation of how they might fit together to show that it's logically consistent. If she's saying there isn't an explanation of how these two things fit together that works, then all we have to do is show any possible explanation of how they fit together. But of course, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to tell you exactly why and how I think they do fit together.
As I understand it, in ancient Judaism, there was not this concept of an afterlife. It was not like I'm going to die and go to heaven, or I'm going to go to hell. The importance was really placed on the here and the now, the life that one is experiencing, and that what's important is this life, because nothing comes after it. But then as you move through the Bible, you're going to see heaven evolving to this kind of spiritual place where God lives with his angels, and eventually Christians will go there and they'll live in eternal bliss. And in Revelation, you really start to see this evolved concept of heaven. And you have a place that has costly stones and flowing rivers and pearls and high gates.
So let's talk for just a moment about this idea of the Jewish beliefs and the Jewish Old Testament, and whether there's some sort of an idea of a positive afterlife experience. It's certainly true that God didn't give us all the revelation that we would like to know about every theological thing all at once. That's definitely true. We agree about that. But that doesn't mean that there's no notion of a positive afterlife anywhere in the Old Testament. We need to talk about that for just a moment. Now, Daniel chapter 12 and verse 2 does say, "And many of those who sleep," that's a euphemism for dead, "in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt." And that doesn't go far enough back for some people. So what is said in the Old Testament that could give us some indication of an afterlife? Well, first of all, people are described as either having a good death or a bad death. Well, what is a good death? Some scholars think that a good death must refer to someone who lives a really long life or reaches their elderly period of their life. Some think it means that they had kids. Some think it means that they didn't die in a violent way. And I think that that does serve as an explanation some of the time. But the problem is that's not always the case. That is to say, some people have a good death who did not live into their old age or something. So it doesn't cover all of these things. It seems like there are some figures in the Bible who have a certain optimism about what's going to happen when they die, and others who don't seem to have that optimism. That can give us some indication. There's also this notion in the Old Testament that one will be gathered together with their fathers. And while this is taken to be an idiom, it doesn't explain everything. For example, many scholars think that to be gathered together with one's fathers means that they're going to be buried in the tomb, gathered together into the tomb of their fathers. But this also isn't always the case. For example, Jacob was said to be gathered to his fathers long before he was actually buried. For example, Dr. T. Desmond Alexander from Union Theological Seminary says, "One of the few indications of what became of the righteous after death is the expression to be gathered to one's people, or to be gathered to one's fathers. That these figures of speech do not refer to the interment in the grave of the fathers or the ancestral tomb, as has been maintained, is clear from the fact that Abraham, Aaron, and Moses were not united with their fathers in the grave, nor do they have reference to burial in general. For in the stories of the gathering of Abraham and Isaac, it is expressly added that they were buried. Moreover, Jacob was gathered to his people several months before his body was committed to the ground. Significantly, in their use of the expression to be gathered to one's fathers or people, the biblical writers seem to convey a sense of optimism regarding death. Although death may separate an individual from his family and kin in this life, the righteous are reunited with those members of their families who have already died." But let's just go ahead and put that stuff aside and agree for the sake of argument. It does seem that there is a trajectory from less detailed information about the afterlife to more detailed information about the afterlife throughout the Old Testament and into the New Testament specifically. What do we say about this? Well, there's two options in front of you with that information that Kristi's just laid out for us. You have two options. And they were based a little bit on your presuppositions about things. If you presuppose that this is just a sort of an idea that developed as people just kind of put their own ideas on top of things as time went on.
And the Bible has limited details on heaven, and I think that's to be expected in a collection of ancient writings where all of the authors had different ideas about God, different religions, different cultures, different times.
There's no word from God sort of coming through prophets and things like that. Well, then, yeah, you're going to think that this just developed as an ideology and people in their day put more onto it and it gets more detailed artificially like that. But if, on the other hand, you think that God just doesn't give us all the revelation we could possibly want about everything all at once, if you take the supernatural to be real, if you think that Christianity is true, then it makes sense in just the same way to say that God gave us more revelation as time went on. It really just comes down to which of those two things you choose to affirm based on presuppositions. So this really doesn't count as a point for Kristi. It's just there are two options, and you can choose which one you're going to affirm.
I'm curious why a place like heaven would need gates. Like, if you really think about that, like, gates are meant to protect or to keep things out. And I'm just wondering what God is trying to protect in his heaven or why it needs protecting.
Might not be an exegetically good idea to base your criticism on specific structures in a biblical book that is replete with imagery like this, especially when we understand that part of the point of talking about the gate is to show that there are people on the inside of the gates of the city and there are people on the outside of the gates of the city, both described, and obviously you want to be like the people on the inside of the gates of the city.
But in Revelation 21, 1-4, it says, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God." And in verse 4, it's really important. "He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and every death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning or crying or pain anymore, for the former things have passed away." It's giving us this picture of like God's up there in his space with his angels and his heavenly things. And then one day it's all going to kind of descend onto the earth.
Now, notice the rhetorical amusement that she exudes when she talks about these Christian ideas.
God's up there, descend onto the earth, onto the earth.
We need to notice when the rhetoric is mere rhetoric and not really a criticism.
And everybody will live and be happy, and there will be no more pain, there will be no tears, no death. All of the bad things that we experience here in this life will be no more, and everything will be just eternal happy bliss. So let's keep this in mind. Keep that in the back of your mind as we move on and we kind of touch on free will. Now, again, free will is very difficult to define. I think even a lot of people who are viewing this now might disagree with the definition that I give here. But according to Oxford Dictionary, free will is the power of acting without the constraint of necessity or fate, the ability to act at one's own discretion. Important to note in this definition that free will requires that there is no kind of outside force that is swinging you in one direction or the other, that you're not confined to your own fate or to the consequences of making the wrong choice. And if that's the case, and you're being told that you must follow this religion, otherwise there will be very severe consequences for not choosing this religion, then you are quite literally within the constraint of your own fate. And that would be the opposite of free will. And I've talked about this before on this channel and on TikTok, that the very idea that God would present you with two options, that you can choose him or you can choose hell, is quite literally the opposite of offering free will. But apologists have found a really creative ways to kind of skirt around this.
Okay, so we're going to get to the definition that Kristi supplies in just a few minutes, but there is a mess here and we need to try and untangle it as best we can. So when we're talking about free will, as Christians, we're talking about basically two options: libertarian freedom and determinism. And on determinism, there are Calvinist Christians who understand compatibilism, which is determinism, but is a way of talking about a kind of freedom where you're morally responsible, even if determinism is true. So you have these two views, basically libertarian freedom and determinism. Libertarian freedom is the notion that whatever you end up choosing, you could have chosen otherwise, at least in most situations. But at base, what it means is nothing external to you is philosophically determining what's going to happen, what you're going to choose. Nothing external to you is determining your choices, your actions. On compatibilism, determinism is true, but so long as you're doing whatever you want, so long as what you're doing is what you want, even if that want is the result of a deterministic process or the decree and ordination of God or whatever secondary causes, the fact is, whatever you want, as long as you're doing what you want, well, then you're not then you have free will. That's the notion, but it's a different understanding of free will. So that's an understanding of free will on determinism that we call that compatibilism, and then there is libertarian freedom. Those are the two things that Christians are talking about, and that's going to be important as we move on.
And I think that when Christians say free will, what they really mean is free choice. And I don't think that free choice and free will are necessarily synonymous. I think they're two different concepts. But I really do think that when Christians are kind of presenting this idea of free will, especially within the context of suffering and pain and the problem of evil, I think they're more so talking about free choice. And so that's how we're going to kind of move forward in this discussion, because I'm trying to kind of work within the boundaries of the Christian theology. So we have this idea that there is this free choice that God has given human beings, that everyone has the option to either choose to do good, choose God, choose heaven, or to choose the other way, which is hell and destruction. And they believe that this was a kind thing to do. This was the best thing God could do for you, was to instill you with this freedom of choice, so you're not just some programmed robot or puppet doing whatever God says. And so because of this free will, some people choose to do really bad things. Therefore, we have suffering. That's just the way of life. That's the way God designed things. And it's the only way we can truly be free, is if we have the freedom to do what we shouldn't do.
So she gives her definition, and then she wants to explain some sort of a difference between free choice and free will. Now, I don't know what she's trying to say here exactly. I'm not sure what the distinction is supposed to be. So I can only really guess. I think she's trying to say something like, if we put the philosophical discussion about free will aside, what we're interested in is whether one is presented with what appears, boots on the ground, to be more than one available option. And she wants to say that the two options don't realistically give you a free choice. But that's not true either. Even on the definition she provided, you have a free choice that is not philosophically necessary or fated, and it's up to your own discretion. It's just that it's a really obvious choice to either trust or reject God. A good choice versus a bad choice. So am I skirting around this, or am I literally explaining that you actually have two choices, life or death? Here's my advice: choose life that you may live. And as for what Christians mean when they talk about free will when arguments from evil are raised, hi, Kristi, Christian here. I'll tell you what we're thinking about. Either libertarian freedom, like me, or compatibilistic freedom, in the case of a Calvinist. As for Christians like me who affirm libertarian free will, we're saying that nothing external to you determines the choice that you will make, and that means that you're free. And as much as it seems to you that choice between life and death is no choice at all, the reality is it's still a libertarianly free choice. Even if you were in solitary confinement in a 100 square foot room and you had very limited options, you would still be libertarianly free in that setup. You just would have a limited range of options to exercise your libertarian free will. Now, on Calvinistic compatibilism, which is deterministic, God has already decreed and ordained what's going to happen, and so long as you are still choosing what you most want, then you're said to be free on this system, and so you have a free choice. Now, I reject compatibilism, but I'm just giving you the two options on Christianity and showing that in both cases, you have what the Christian understands to be a free choice. Christians who affirm either will still say you're free in the scenario you presented. Now, even though she doesn't use this terminology, she spends now a substantial portion of the video talking about what it would be like if in heaven humans don't have libertarian freedom and angels don't have libertarian freedom. Since I think that angels do have libertarian freedom and in heaven humans will have libertarian freedom, I'm going to skip to the portion where she talks about that.
Then we have scenario 2, which is, yes, there is free will in heaven. Okay, so you will have freedom. He's not going to take it away because God loves us so much. He gave us free will. He wouldn't just take it away from us. And angels, they've got free will too. We've got free will. Everybody's free. But this unloads a lot more questions for me. Because heaven is a place with no tears, no pain, no death, no suffering, no mourning, no sin at all. But in order to have free will, we must also have mourning, death, sin, suffering, all of those bad things, because it is the consequence of free will. They fit together. You have to have them, right? So how is there a place that exists with free will, but also has no sin or suffering? What changes is my question.
So what changes, she wants to know. How is it that in heaven, if we have libertarian freedom, then we will still never see sin, pain, suffering? None of that's going to happen in heaven. Well, there are a number of options that Christian thinkers have put forward over the years. One would be that you'll still have free will in heaven. It'll just be like here on earth, you might have more or less options to exercise your free will. In heaven, you won't have the option to sin. It'll be like sin is just one less thing you have in heaven. If, for example, we took Diet Coke away from the earth right now, it wouldn't mean that you weren't free anymore. It just, you have one less option of what to drink, but you're still free. Maybe in heaven, it'll be like that, and we just won't have sin as an option anymore. But that doesn't really work, I don't think, because in heaven, sin isn't really, and even right now, sin isn't just one thing that you can choose to do or not. There's a moment-by-moment opportunity to sin by doing what God doesn't want you to do, or disobeying him, or doing something wicked. So I don't think it's like one thing that we can just subtract from heaven. So I don't think that answer works. Another answer is that I do think works is that in heaven, we technically would, logically speaking, have the freedom to sin. It's just that we never do, and it would be absurd. So right now, for example, it may well be the case that a person could live their whole life, and in each instance where they could sin or could not sin, they could choose not to sin. It's just that nobody ever does. Scripture tells us nobody ever will, aside from Jesus, and the idea is absurd for those of us living in this reality. And the inverse for me would be true in heaven. That's how I see it. That perhaps logically someone could commit a sin. It's just the idea is absurd, and we're told that it will never happen. Now, how could that be? Well, perhaps in heaven we will have just learned what we need to learn by that point, and we'll get to that in just a moment. So, for example, let's say I've got two daughters, and both of my daughters, when they were very young in the sandbox, chose to take sand or dirt and put it up to their mouth and put it in their mouth like they're going to eat it, because kids do that with everything. And it didn't take but once or twice for them to learn that's not something I want to do. They learned that lesson. And when they're 30 years old, I'm not worried that they're going to be somewhere across town downing buckets of sand because they got some crazy sand addiction. I'm not worried about that. Could they technically do it? Could they mechanically put the sand to their mouth and swallow it? Sure, they could, logically speaking, but they won't. And the idea is absurd. And so the notion is, in heaven, could someone sin? Perhaps, logically speaking, they could mechanically do it. They could string syllables together and words together and sounds to say something sinful, or they could perform some action that would be sinful, but they won't. And the idea is as absurd as eating sand. Why would you eat sand once you've learned the lesson about that?
Why couldn't have God set this entire system up in the first place to be just like that? To be just like heaven, where you have free will, you're free and all that, but there is still no sin or suffering. If it's possible in heaven, why is it not possible here on earth? And if suffering results from free will naturally, then how can we have free will in heaven, a place without suffering?
So the next question is, if that's the case, then why is it that we only have that in heaven, and God couldn't just set up things such that we could have that experience in that reality right now? And to this, we would have to say, perhaps it is the case that experiencing the pain and suffering of this life is part of, and I'm going to say more about this in just a few minutes, but is part of the explanation of why it will appear to us like eating sand in heaven, because we've seen what that accomplishes. We've seen how absurd it is. And Graham Oppy, in his book Arguing About Gods, actually addresses this question and provides one explanation that he's heard that he think actually would, perhaps, technically, logically speaking, resolve this problem. What if God is, as the Molinist conceives, aware in his omniscience of all of the possible worlds, all of the ways he could create, and what would result in all of those possible worlds? And a possible world is not a world that exists somewhere, but it's something God would know, and it's a possible world so long as there's no logical contradictions in it. So, for example, a world that is where no music ever existed, or nobody has a left arm. For all I know, that seems like a possible world. There's no contradiction, so maybe that's a possible world. But a world with only two-dimensional square circles is not a possible world, so that world isn't even possible. It doesn't exist. It couldn't possibly exist. Okay, so what if in God's awareness of possible worlds, he's aware of a world where you get a free heaven where no one ever sins, but that is only possible if it is conjoined with a world of free creatures on earth before heaven, in which there's a lot of sin and all the sorts of things that we have now. What if this is the possible world that God knows is the one that gets you an ultimately free heaven of free creatures where no one chooses to sin? where it's logically possible, but no one freely chooses to ever do it. That would make sense of the situation. Oppie says, one option here might be to follow the Molinist version of the free will defense developed in Plantinga. Suppose that there are true counterfactuals of freedom, and that the truth of these counterfactuals of freedom is not something that can just be chosen by a perfect being. For all we know, it is logically possible that when a perfect being comes to create contingent things, it has open to it the option of making a universe in which free creatures freely go wrong that is conjoined to a heaven in which free creatures always freely go right, but it does not have open to it the option of making a universe in which free creatures always freely go right. In Plantinga's terms, even though all of the creaturely essences that the perfect being can instantiate suffer from transworld depravity, at least some of those essences have possible instantiations in which their final segments always go right. So we'd have to address Oppie's other criticisms of Molinism on a different point, on a different day, in a different video. But if Molinism is true, he says, here's a possibility that doesn't seem to create any additional problems. It seems to work, at least logically speaking. And that would explain why it may be that if God wants to create free creatures, which he doesn't have to do, but if he wants to create free creatures for all the reasons that Kristi gave us, well, then he may have this possible world available to him where you have a world of sin that results in a heaven where no one freely chooses to sin.
I have had some very creative answers to this question. And one of those answers is, well, God gives us a new nature. He changes us and he transforms us so that once we get to heaven, we'll no longer want to sin. And I'm wondering, well, when does this transformation take place? Does it take place here on earth? Does it take place after you go to heaven? Because if it took place here on earth, then Christians would never sin again. But we know that's not true. We know Christians still sin, and most of them, I think, will admit that they still sin. So the transformation doesn't happen here on earth. It happens once you die. Why? Why are you being transformed only after you die and get to this new heavenly realm? And if you're being transformed and you're being changed, and from this transformation and this change, you will no longer have the desire to do terrible things or to sin. What exactly happens during that transformation? Because to me, it just seems as though you're being reprogrammed, essentially, right? God doesn't want worship robots. He doesn't want to just program you to force you to do what he wants you to do. I guess what I'm asking is, how is giving someone a new nature different than removing free will?
So she wants to know, what does this transformation look like? Well, she goes with the notion that God will change our nature. Let's talk about what that could look like, boots on the ground, in an earthy sort of down-to-earth sort of way, counterintuitively. There are a couple of ways people have thought about this. Catholics have this doctrine of purgatory, right? And I don't believe in purgatory, but it's interesting that some people like Jerry Walls do. What would make them believe in purgatory? I'm just laying all the options out. Well, one of the reasons is because Christians have this idea of justification and then sanctification, which is throughout our life, the process of with the cooperation of the Holy Spirit, becoming more and more like Jesus. And so some have reason that if you have a person who becomes a Christian at, say, 9 years old, say a girl becomes a Christian at 9 years old, and she begins the process of sanctification, of becoming more and more like Jesus under the conviction of the Holy Spirit. And let's say she lives to 99 years old. That's a lot of time for that process to work on her, to make her more and more like Jesus. But let's say you have a guy who kind of lives like the devil. He's 25 years old, and he becomes a Christian one night. And then the next day, he's in a terrible car accident and dies, God forbid. Well, in such a case, he had almost no time to go along that process of sanctification, of becoming more like Jesus. So Walls says something like purgatory might make sense, because that's where that process, if we think sanctification is important, plays out. And that may go on for who knows how long before you are sort of made fit in that sense, learned the lesson, continued the process, completed the process. And that would explain how maybe some of this works. On the other hand, for me, I think that not only experiencing the pain and suffering of this world, but also then seeing the judgment that is going to take place in the end. We're going to see the judgment and the shame that is poured out on sin as it has played out in all of its particulars in this world. That will be like, as some have said, a university of sin. And who knows how long that process will take. But you will gain a lot of information from that. And then, of course, thirdly, you are in the very presence of God, and this must have some sort of an impact. Think about it in a very natural way, though. We encounter single events in our life that are fairly natural, but when they happen to us, they dramatically change us. We have paradigm shifts, and there are certain actions that we took prior to that we will never take again. In a similar way, if we experience all that we experience in this life of pain and suffering and sin, and then we experience the judgment, we see what sin has done in all its particulars, and we're in the presence of God, these are major, major things. And when we experience them, yes, they're going to have major paradigm shifting impact on us. It's such that yes, it well could be the case that after that, we are now a person who understands that sin in heaven would be like eating sand, and it would be absurd that we would ever do it again. But our free will has at no point been violated.
It seems as though this new nature is just a way to reword things so it doesn't sound as though God is taking away your free will when he actually is.
Now, far from doing some sort of acrobatics to somehow make this work, I'm just walking through it. Kristi's doing an internal criticism, which means if we assume Christianity is true, to look at it from the inside and see if it all works, then how does this make sense? And I'm just simply saying, okay, internal to Christianity, if we're saying these events are going to take place, ultimately, then it's the most natural thing in the world to me to see that if you experience those things, they would have such a dramatic effect on your thinking freely that you would end up being the kind of person that sees sin as eating sand. Why would you ever want to do such a thing?
It's just messy. It's really messy when you start to really kind of pick it up. I feel like my mind just like goes all over the place.
I don't think this is messy at all. As I said before, I think this is a natural expectation. If you imagine one experiencing life in a fallen world, becoming viscerally aware of the judgment on sin, experiencing the vision of God, and moving forward to live in that presence forever. And this is especially true if God sovereignly actualized a world in which there is sin this side of heaven, but won't be that side of heaven. Now, even if you think differently than me about these things, remember that she's made the claim that these two things don't fit together, which means that all we have to do to defeat that claim is to present any explanation that might possibly be true that would alleviate what she sees as an incoherence. And I think we've done that.
The main goal of this channel, I've realized actually lately, is not to present this neatly packaged presentation that will convince you of something. I don't want to do that here. And I don't even want that responsibility or that pressure. What I want to do is to lay it all out and to examine it, to explore it, to ask the hard questions, to see where they lead. And there are things that I'm going to miss. There are things that I'm going to forget. There are things that I'm not going to have considered that I'm hoping people in the comments will write and help me consider. But I just want to kind of serve in this role of showing you that you can ask the hard questions, you can scrutinize it, you can think about it, you can explore it, and when it doesn't make sense, you're allowed to reject it.
That would be fine. And I think these are fantastic questions. It's just that you're not just asking questions. You're making claims. And you're making them in front of 23,000 viewers, at least as of this recording. You're saying
heaven and angels and free will and how they all come together and they just don't work together. It all falls apart when you really consider all the pieces and parts that they're feeding you in the church.
But these claims fail. And if you're interested in considering options that some Christian might give you, or if you're just watching this and you're interested in considering those options, I hope you'll consider this one.